Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we are going to distinguish between a movement along the supply curve and a movement of the supply curve. Now, these are two very different things, and it's something that we really need to be very clear about in terms of our study of economics. Now, if you're new to my discussion of supply, you might want to check out the intro to supply and also the very important factors that affect supply. That's super important for this video. Links to those are in the description. You should probably start there and then come to this video. But if you're ready to roll, I'm ready to roll with you. So in terms of these concepts, this movement along the supply curve and the movement of the supply curve, we need to be clear about what happens, why do they happen, and why are they different. So if we look at movements along the supply curve, they are caused by changes in price of the good itself. So let's say we're talking about staplers. The price of staplers change, then the level of supply changes along the supply curve. But if we think about movements of the supply curve, this is where the supply curve gets up, moves to the left, moves to the right, and it's not along the curve, it's actually getting up and moving. So while movements along the supply curve are caused by changes in the price of the good itself, that a movement of the curve is caused by changes in factors other than price. It's caused by changes in factors that affect the level of supply. And you can get to my video on those factors by clicking the link above, but also you can see them displayed over here, that I've focused on 5 factors that when these factors change, that will lead to the supply curve getting up, moving to the left, moving to the right. So it is a bit of a tricky distinction, but what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the electronic virtual whiteboard and go through and draw some examples to try and make it clear. The only thing that you should sort of be vaguely clear on at this stage is just that a movement along the supply curve that's caused by a change in the price of the good itself, a movement of the supply curve, now that's caused by a factor other than price. Okay, let's get drawing. Okay, so here we are looking at movements along the supply curve, and the important part in terms of this section, if we're looking at movements along the supply curve, this is caused by changes in price of the good itself. So if we're talking about socks, it's caused by changes in the price of those socks. That's what causes a movement along the supply curve. So let's get started in terms of looking at this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it up as we usually would. So I've got price and we've got quantity and we've got 0 here. And what we'll do is we'll just draw the supply curve as we normally would. So we've got our supply curve here. You could do it on both sides if you wanted. And you can see that it is upward sloping in terms of this, that we can see that in terms of the way it's set up, that our graph is following that law of supply, that as there is an increase in price, there will be an increase in quantity supply. So what we'll do is we'll start and we'll say, okay, let's call this point A. So let's say we've got price and we've got quantity supplied in terms of this, because this graph is just referring to supply. So what we're going to do is we're going to say our starting point is at A, and what we'll do is we'll do 2 situations of a rise in price and a fall in price. So let's grab our purple pen. So let's say that point B is where there is a higher price. So between P and P1, there has been an increase in price as we've moved further away from the point of 0. So in looking at this, what we can say is we can say, okay, if we go from A to B, so we go this way, that price goes up, and have a look at this. We now go to quantity supplied 1, so QS1, and that what that represents is as it goes further away from 0, that represents more production, that firms will be supplying more. But it's very important that you get the language right here. So let's do it bit by bit. So let's say that as we go from A to B, that this is caused by a price going from P to P1. So what we can say is that price has increased. Okay, so that's the first movement. That's our starting point. And what we say then is that, okay, price has increased, and therefore what we've seen is that QS goes to QS1, that the level of supply is higher. But this is not an increase. That will be perhaps where it could be a bit tricky. That this type of growth in supply, that this is what's known as an expansion of supply. So this movement here, this growth from A to B, so it's an expansion of supply. So the important point is, as I discussed at the beginning of the video, is that because it is caused by a change in the price of the good itself, that it is either an expansion or a contraction. So when the price of its good itself, when the price of the good itself increases, that is what's known as an expansion of supply. So what we'll do is we'll now flip the situation. We'll grab our blue pen, and we can then, let's put a little line between these two things here. So what we'll say is we said, okay, so over here we've looked at the increase in price. What would happen though if we get a situation where price falls? So we were at P, so now we're at P2. So we've seen another kind of movement where price has fallen, and instead of going from A to B, instead we've gone from A to C. And furthermore, we were at quantity supplied, but since price falls, we actually now move to QS2. And that because we're moving closer to zero now, that is actually a reduction, that we're going that way. Okay, so we're starting to put it together a little bit. So now on this side, we're looking at, okay, we're going from A to C, from A to C. So if we follow the same pattern there, so what we're saying is that this is caused by P to P2. This is caused by the fall in price of the good itself, remember, because we're looking at this situation. So then what we can say is, okay, so P has decreased. And then, furthermore, that what happens is we go from QS, let's keep it consistent, QS to QS2, which is demonstrated in this part of the graph there. Now, this is not a decrease in supply because remember, we're looking at the price of the good itself. So what we call here is, so this is a contraction of supply, that supply becomes smaller. Because remember in this situation, we said, if there's an increase in price, an increase in quantity supplied, what we're seeing in this movement here is actually a fall in price, which leads to a reduction in quantity supplied. So this is a contraction of supply, which is still obeying the law of supply. So what we'll do is we'll come over this graph, give this a bit of a circle, so that we've got an expansion of supply and a contraction of supply demonstrated on this graph. Just to remind ourselves one more time that if we're looking at movements along the supply curve, that it is caused by changes in the price of the good itself. In the price of the good itself, not in any other factor. So that is our movement along the supply curve, our expansion over here, and our contraction over there. Okay, so now we're looking at movement of the supply curve. So not along, very much of. So let's just navigate this. So we're looking at movement of the supply curve. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at an increase in supply. So I'll just put that here to remind myself. Okay, so we're looking at an increase of supply. So what we might start by thinking about is thinking, why would supply increase? So why would a firm be able to produce more? That's kind of like what we're trying to show or explain through this graph. And so what we're saying is that when we look at a movement of the curve, like the whole curve gets up and moves, what we're looking at is factors other than price. So in the previous graph, we looked at expansion or contraction. We were talking about the price of the good itself changes. Here, when we're talking about a movement of the whole curve gets up and moves, we're looking at factors other than price that allow a firm to produce more. So we're saying, okay, this factor changes and then supply will increase, or in our next graph will decrease. So that this is kind of our relationship here. A factor changes, a factor of supply changes, a factor affecting supply changes, which then leads to an increase in supply. So this particular graph, let's focus on an example. Let's say, okay, so for a particular firm, so if we're looking at this, so let's say that there is an improvement in technology so that the firm is now able to increase supply at a lower cost, right? So it's a good factor in terms of supply. So let's start in terms of showing what this graph would look like. So we've got our typical setup. So we'll say, okay, this is price. This is the point 0. This is quantity. Geez, almost got that wrong. And then we'll just include our regular looking supply curve. So there's our supply curve. And what we'll do is we'll just create a point showing price and quantity. So we'll say it's around about the middle. So what we'll say is that this is our equilibrium point. Now, don't worry if that's a little bit confusing when we put supply and demand together. That will all make sense. But for now, let's just say, okay, this is price equilibrium and this is quantity equilibrium. It's kind of like the middle point here. So if we return to our example, which is here, if we're saying that technology improves, there's greater innovation, a firm will be able to produce more. So what will happen is that we're going to move the whole supply curve to the right. So you can see here that because of the improvement in technology, that we've actually been able to shift supply to the right, that this is an increase in supply, and I'm going to show you why in just a second. So what we can do is we can now extend this at this price equilibrium, and let's extend that, let's call this point B, and then we'll bring this down here, and we'll call this Q1. Can you see here that at the same price, at that price equilibrium, that actually the firm can produce more? So that at the same price, as selling it to the public at the same price, that the firm has actually been able to increase production. So what we can say is that, what we're saying here is that in our example, as technology improves, a firm can produce more at the same or lower cost, so that we move from S to S1. And what we can say here is that actually, we can say that supply increases from S to S1, that this is an increase because it is a factor other than price. So you can see again that we've gone from point A to point B as we've shifted from S to S1. And don't forget that the quantity that's being supplied by the firm has increased along the bottom. Okay, so this is a movement of the supply curve, an increase in supply. Remember, movement of the whole curve caused by factors other than price. Now let's move to a decrease in supply. Okay, so for our final graph here, we're still looking at a movement of the curve, right? So movement of the supply curve, and we're looking at a decrease in supply. So I might just say, okay, a decrease in supply. And remember, because we're looking at a movement of the curve, we're looking at factors other than price of the good itself. Wow, look how terrible that is. Price, better, of the good itself. So we're not looking at that change in price. Remember that change in price, expansion or contraction, movement along the curve. Here we're looking at that movement of the curve. Okay, and so we're looking at a decrease in supply. So let's just think about, if we're thinking about a situation that would lead to a decrease in supply, we're looking at a situation where a firm is going to produce less at every price. So what we might say is, to cause that decrease in supply, there is an increase in the costs of production. If it's more expensive, firms are going to produce less. So let's say that the rise in the cost of production is due to the rise in the cost of inputs. Inputs being resources, things that go into the production. And let's say that the rise in the cost of input is a rise in wages, and wages relates to the cost of labor inputs. So essentially what we're saying here is wages go up, workers are more expensive, then the firm reduces production. So let's start in the usual way. We do price here, zero here, quantity here. Let's include a regular supply curve. Okay, and then let's just resume with that middle point, that equilibrium point, which we will go into more detail with when we bring demand and supply together. Okay, so we've got PE, we've got QE, we've got point A here, and we've got our supply curve. So what we're saying is that supply is going to decrease. So the firm is going to produce less at the same level of prices. So essentially what we're kind of thinking about is if it's going to produce less, we're going to go closer to zero. So rather than moving to the right, we're going to shift to the left, to the left, to the left. So that this here is S1, our new supply curve, and that what we would do is we would always include that arrow just to show that is the movement, right? We've gone from S to S1. Now we're going to demonstrate that at this new supply curve, the firm is producing less. So let's grab a different color pen. Let's grab purple. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, that's price equilibrium on this new curve on S1. And then we'll bring this down here and we'll call that Q1. So what we're saying here is that at the same price at PE, that actually the firm is going to produce less. That we started out at QE, production costs went up, now the firm is going to produce Q1 because of this shift in the supply curve. So let's put a little bit of information down. So what we're saying is that costs of production go up. So what we're saying is that there has been a decrease in supply, and that this decrease in supply is witnessed from the movement S to S1. So S to S1. So this arrow is what we're explaining here. So what we're saying is that as supply increases, as supply decreases, the firm will produce less at all prices. And we can see that here, that at price equilibrium, it used to produce QE, and now it's only producing Q1. So therefore, it is a decrease in supply. And this decrease in supply is really due to the fact that it is more expensive for the firm to produce because workers are more expensive. So this arrow here, this movement here, it shows this decrease in supply, that this movement, this decrease in supply. And remember that it is a decrease, not a contraction, because it is due to factors other than the price of the good itself. And the factor here is this rising cost of inputs. The higher wages, the rising cost of labor resources has led to this decrease in supply. Okay, so in this video, we've had a look at the difference between a movement along the supply curve versus a movement of the supply curve itself. Now, the thing we have to get very clear about, the thing we have to be so crystal clear about, is that a movement along the supply curve, okay, that's caused by changes in the price of the good itself. But a movement of the supply curve, whether it goes to the left, to the right, is that right, left? Anyway, it goes to the left or the right, that is caused by a factor other than price. Some of those factors that affect the level of supply in an economy. Okay, so any questions, comments, clarifications, jokes, anything like that, just put them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.